This diagram shows the top-level processes for IT asset configuration management. The purpose of IT asset configuration management is to ensure the integrity of assets and configurations that are required to control IT services and infrastructure, as well as to protect the integrity of service assets and configuration items throughout the service lifecycle, and to ensure that only authorized components are used and only authorized configuration changes are made. There are relationships between IT asset configuration management and the various other processes. The goals of IT asset configuration management are to support the business and customer service objectives and requirements, as well as supporting efficient and effective IT service management processes. In this diagram, we have the top-level process, or a high-level process flow of the individual processes that make up IT asset configuration management. As you can see, at the starting process, we have input, and that input is coming from several different RTD processes that will feed into IT asset configuration management. So the process is going to be initiated based on any type of request which results in the purchase of a configuration item or a configuration item that needs to be modified. And so that can include request fulfillment, problem management, change request, or a part of the annual budgeting process. The first question in this high-level process is whether or not we are dealing with a new item. And so if we are dealing with a new item, we will immediately move on to the first process, which is configuration item and asset identification process. Okay? If it is not a new item, if we're just changing an existing item, we will jump that first process and go to the second process. And the second process is your asset control process. From both of those, we will move on to the decommissioning and reporting process, in which we'll be identifying, recording, reviewing, changing, validating. There will be a number of different steps in that process. If we encounter an exception, such as the asset being withdrawn, then we need asset verification and audit process. If not, then the life cycle will end. So it begins with the creation of configuration items and assets, and then it would ultimately end in the decommissioning and reporting of those assets. If something comes up missing, essentially, then we would go through the asset verification and auditing process. So that's a high-level overview of the top-level processes that make up IT asset configuration management. The first step in the IT asset configuration management process for new items is going to be the identification process. And we have the identification process laid out for us in this flowchart, and we want to work through the individual steps. The first question will be whether or not the new item received, which is step one, so a new item is received, and the IT staff then has the responsibility of answering the question, is it an asset? We'll start with the yes. If it is an asset, we'll move on to step three, where we match the asset with shipping documents and we assign it an asset tag and request a capital asset tag from finance if it is in fact a capital asset. So that proceeds to step four, where we determine, the IT asset manager will determine whether or not a capital asset tag is required. If so, he'll document the request, and finance will then provide a capital asset tag, and that capital asset tag will be affixed to the asset. If a capital asset tag is not required on a new asset, then the IT staff will be responsible for creating and drafting an asset record in the Configuration Manager database. That will be followed by updating the asset attributes and updating the configuration item record status to acquired. Okay? From there, it would move on to step 8, where the asset would be installed and the asset tag would be affixed to it. Okay? But before we go any further, let's go back up. If the answer to the question is that it is not an asset, it immediately moves to step 7. This is a configuration item. And so the IT staff is responsible at that point for identifying the configuration item type and then creating a draft configuration item in the Configuration Manager database and updating the status to acquired. So essentially the difference here is simply configuration item versus asset. From step 8, where change requests need to be created in accordance with the change management process, the responsibility is on the IT staff. The output is the change management process. We're installing that asset, affixing the asset tag, and then the IT staff is responsible for updating the Configuration Manager database and asset attributes, updating the record status to active, as well as reviewing the label and identifying any related assets and configuration items. Ultimately, there, the IT manager will be notified. Once the IT asset manager is notified, it's that individual's responsibility to verify the asset attributes. And that would move us on to step 3.1, which would be the decommissioning and reporting process when and if that becomes required. Now, just as a clarification, configuration items will be hardware, software, documents, information. The naming of those configuration items is going to require you to include the version. An asset is considered to be anything over $5,000, and funded assets will require finance to provide that capital asset tag. So those are the clarifications there as to the different kinds of objects that we might be dealing with. So in this diagram, we see the detailed steps that are a part of the initial configuration item and asset identification process. The asset control process is initiated for existing items as opposed to the identification process, which is associated with new items. This diagram is going to show us the individual steps that make up the asset control process. The process begins with the IT staff identifying that the item does currently exist. In step 2, the IT staff will need to create a change request in accordance with the change management process because we are dealing with an existing item and therefore change to the infrastructure. The IT staff is also responsible for validating the existing configuration item and asset records in the Configuration Management database, as well as identifying and validating related assets and configuration items. Step 3 determines the authorization and accuracy of the configuration item and asset records. Okay? If they are not accurate, then we are going to proceed to step 1 of process number 4, which means that it is an exception. There's an exception to our process flow. Assuming they are authorized and accurate configuration item records, then we are going to proceed to step 4. Step 4, the responsibility of the IT staff is to determine the record status of the configuration item, to update the change in the configuration item and asset record in the database, and then to update any related assets or configuration items. Once these changes have been made, there is an evaluation as to whether or not the configuration item's status is active. If the status is not active, then we are going to move to 3.1, which is the decommission and reporting process. If it is active, then we will continue on and proceed to step 6, where the responsibility shifts from the IT staff to the IT asset manager. The IT asset manager, if necessary, will develop attributes for the configuration items and assets and review changes to the configuration items and any related assets, also only if needed. Assuming that there are changes that are needed, then those changes need to be approved by the change manager. If that approval process is successful, we would move on to step 9. The configuration manager database would be updated. We would review the label and identify any related assets and configuration items, and then we would notify the IT asset manager. Okay. Another thing that would be done there is that the configuration item status would be updated, and we would make sure that that is still maintained as active. But step 10, it's going to be the responsibility of the IT asset manager to verify the asset attributes and to review any changes that have occurred. Now, if up here we needed to make a change and that change was not approved, then we would transfer instead to step 8, where we need to label and identify related assets and configuration items, and then submit that information to the IT asset manager, who will then be working with the change management in order to ensure that we can make these changes in the environment. So there you have the individual steps that make up the asset control process. These are the steps that we will follow if we have identified an asset as an existing item rather than a new item. The final step in the life cycle of assets and configuration items will be the decommission and reporting process. And this diagram is going to show us information about the detailed steps that make up that process. Recall that both new items and existing items will flow into this step, as this step is just a part of the ongoing life cycle. At the point that we arrive here, the first determination is actually step 2, not shown, of determining whether the status is active. But if the IT staff determines that a configuration item is no longer fit for its purpose or it has no further use, then the status can be verified. Is the item status withdrawn? If it is not, then we end the process. We're not decommissioning it. If it is withdrawn, then the IT staff would be responsible for making sure that the status of the asset is updated to withdrawn, okay, in order to, or for the record that exists in the configuration management database. We would also identify any existing assets and configuration items that would be affected, update those related assets and items, and then submit to the asset manager for review and approval. There is a possibility, depending on the asset, that we would need to remove hard disks, okay, and or any data that is associated with that asset or configuration item. Step 6 is the asset manager being responsible for validating changes to the assets and related assets and configuration items, validating and identifying any relationships that would potentially need to be established. And from there, sending an approval of the status change back to the IT staff, which is step 9. And the IT staff would then be responsible for verifying the related assets and for following the change management processes to decommission the asset. At that point, you would want to update the configuration manager database and any design documentation and gather assets that require disposal, identify the process that you will use for disposal, and then send documentation to finance. It will then be the responsibility of finance to verify capital assets, to document the capital asset tag number as being withdrawn, and to require approvals for the disposal request. That's something that's going to be very important to the process as we move to step 11, and that's that we have correctly identified the appropriate disposal process to be used, gotten approvals for that request, and then notified the IT staff for disposal. The responsibility will then shift to the IT staff, who will be responsible to verify assets with the approved disposal list, then to dispose of those assets, and then to update the configuration database indicating that they have now been disposed. And from that point, it would move on to step 4.1, which would be the verification and audit. So in this graphic, we have looked at the individual steps in relation to the decommission and reporting process for IT asset configuration management.